alien showed me the book of life, and what I saw will terrify you. A being from another world landed in rural Tennessee and revealed to a broken man that the book of life isn't what the church has been teaching for 2,000 years. What David Holloway discovered that night will shatter everything you believe about judgment, destiny, and the nature of your soul. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about a quantum field of living memory that records every single thought you've ever had, and an extraterrestrial who proved that Jesus came to teach us how to rewrite it. This truth has been buried beneath centuries of doctrine and fear. Once you see what David saw inside that translucent craft, there's no going back to comfortable beliefs. This will give you power over your own fate, but it may cost you the security of everything you were taught to accept without question. If you're ready to discover why forgiveness is actually a technology and not just a virtue, subscribe and activate the bell, because what happened to this 56-year-old widower will fundamentally rewire how you see God, free will, and the light patterns your life is creating right now. Now, let me tell you how it all began. David Holloway lived alone among charred books and memories that cut him like glass. The cabin creaked at night, not from wind, but from something heavier. Guilt has weight. You can hear it in the floorboards. You can feel it pressing against your chest when you try to sleep. He was 56 years old, widowed, former librarian. A man whose hands once turned pages with reverence now trembled when they touched anything at all. The fire had taken everything. Not just the town library where he'd worked for 32 years. Not just the building with its mahogany shelves and the smell of old paper that he loved more than anything. The fire took his wife too, Margaret. She'd gone back inside for something, he never knew what, and the roof collapsed before he could stop her. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of living in this cabin by Lake Norris, surrounded by the few books he'd managed to salvage. Most of them damaged, pages brown at the edges, spines cracked, words interrupted by black stains that looked like sin itself had touched them. He couldn't throw them away. Some nights he'd pick one up, run his fingers over the burned parts, and wonder if this was how God saw him. Salvageable but damaged, useful once but now just a reminder of what was lost. The wood groaned under him as he shifted in his chair. The cabin wasn't old, but it felt ancient, like it had absorbed his sorrow and aged faster because of it. Every board, every beam seemed to carry the weight of his regret. His faith had been strong once, real, the kind that made you wake up grateful, the kind that turned every sunrise into proof of something greater. But that fire burned more than books and flesh. It burned his certainty. Now when he prayed, the words felt hollow. When he read scripture, the promises seemed written for someone else, someone who deserved them, someone who hadn't let his wife die while he stood frozen in the parking lot, screaming her name. The ashes visited him in dreams, always the same. He'd be walking through the library, and everything would be perfect. The shelves full, the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Then he'd see Margaret at the front desk, smiling at him the way she used to. And then the smoke would come, thick and black, pouring from nowhere and everywhere. He'd run toward her, but his legs wouldn't move right, like running through water. She'd look at him calmly, no fear in her eyes, and mouth words he could never hear. Then he'd wake up, always at the same time, 3:47 in the morning, the exact time the roof collapsed. Tonight was no different, except the silence felt heavier. The air in the cabin seemed to hum with something he couldn't name. He sat in his reading chair, the same one he'd sat in for 1,000 nights, and stared at the Bible on the table beside him. He hadn't opened it in weeks. What was the point? Every verse about mercy felt like mockery. Every promise of peace seemed meant for better men. The Tennessee wind picked up outside, whistling through the pines that surrounded the cabin. It sounded almost like voices, old voices, familiar ones. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about what they might be saying. Then he heard it, the soft rustle of paper. His eyes snapped open. The Bible's pages were turning, by themselves, slowly, deliberately, as if invisible fingers were searching for something specific. David's heart kicked hard against his ribs. He didn't move, couldn't move, just watched as page after page flipped in the windless room until finally they stopped. Revelation, chapter 20, verse 12. The words seemed to glow. Not literally, he told himself it wasn't literal, but they stood out from the page like they'd been written in different ink. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the Book of Life. Book of Life. The phrase burned itself into his vision. He'd read it 100 times before, 1,000, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like those words were written specifically for him, right now, this moment. Fear and curiosity tangled in his chest like fighting snakes. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His rational mind told him it was just wind from a crack in the wall, just air pressure, just coincidence, but his body knew better. Something was calling him, not with sound, not with words, but with a pull he felt in his bones, a direction his soul recognized before his mind could catch up. He stood slowly, legs shaking, moved toward the door, without deciding to move. His hand reached for the handle, and the cold metal felt like the only real thing in the world. The call was coming from the lake. He knew it the way you know you're being watched, the way you know when someone's standing behind you even before you turn around. David opened the door and stepped into the night. The Tennessee darkness swallowed him whole, but he walked forward anyway, following something he couldn't see toward something he didn't understand. The path to the lake had never felt this long before. Every step seemed to take him further from everything he knew and closer to something impossible. Outside, the night was breathing. That's the only way David could describe it. The darkness wasn't empty. It pulsed. It moved. The silence of the Tennessee countryside felt alive in a way that made his skin prickle with electricity. He walked down the dirt path toward Lake Norris, his bare feet finding stones and roots in the dark. He should have been cold, should have been terrified. Instead, he felt pulled forward by invisible hands, moved by a force that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. Then he saw it. Over the black mirror of the lake, a sphere of white light rotated slowly in the air, not spinning wildly, not moving erratically like something out of control. It turned with purpose, with intention, like a planet in orbit, following laws David didn't know existed. The light was pure, not harsh like a spotlight, not soft like a lantern. It was clean in a way that made everything else look dirty by comparison. The surface of Lake Norris trembled beneath it. The water rippled outward in perfect concentric circles, as if the lake itself recognized what was hovering above it, as if it was bowing. David stopped walking. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. His mind scrambled for explanations. Military aircraft, weather phenomenon, hallucination brought on by grief and isolation. But his body knew. This was divine. Or if not divine, then something so far beyond human that the difference didn't matter. The sphere began to open, not like a door, not like anything mechanical. It simply parted. The light folded back on itself like petals of a flower made from pure luminescence, revealing something inside. A figure stood in the opening, humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but wrong in ways that made David's eyes water when he tried to focus. The proportions were too perfect, the symmetry too exact. The skin, if it was skin, seemed to shimmer between solid and translucent, like looking at someone through clear water. But the eyes, God, the eyes, they were large, larger than human eyes should be, and they held something David had never seen in any human face before. Not cruelty, not indifference, something that felt like looking into the heart of compassion itself. The being didn't move, didn't step toward him, just stood in that opening of light, watching him with those impossible eyes. And then David heard it, not with his ears, with something deeper, a voice that bypassed sound entirely and spoke directly into the center of his awareness. I come to show you the record of all that lives. The words didn't echo. They simply appeared in his mind, fully formed, carrying weight and meaning that went beyond language. David tried to speak. His mouth opened. His throat worked. But nothing came out except a small, broken sound that might have been a word or might have been a prayer. The air around him grew thick, heavy, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike, charged with potential energy. Time felt wrong. Too slow, too fast, both at once. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously, and David had the dizzying sensation that he was standing in a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where causality bent, where past and future leaked into the present. The being stepped forward, not walking exactly, moving without moving, gliding as if the space between the craft and the shore was just a suggestion rather than a fixed distance. Fear should have consumed him. David knew that. He should have been running, screaming, losing his mind. Instead, something else happened. The terror inside him began to dissolve, not all at once, not like a switch being flipped, but gradually, like ice melting in warm water, because the presence emanating from this being wasn't threatening. It was compassionate, deeply, fundamentally compassionate in a way that made David want to weep. This wasn't a predator. This wasn't something that wanted to harm him or take from him or use him. This was something that saw him, truly saw him. Saw the guilt and the grief and the 3 years of self-inflicted punishment, and looked at all of it with nothing but understanding. David fell to his knees, not from fear, from relief, from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that whatever this being was, it didn't judge him the way he judged himself. "Who are you?" he whispered, and this time the words came out. The being tilted its head slightly. The gesture was so human, so familiar, that it made David's chest ache. "A messenger," the voice said in his mind. "A guide, a witness to the truth that has been buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding." The light behind the being pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat made visible. "You have been taught to fear the record," the voice continued, "to fear the book that contains every deed, every thought, every moment of your existence. You believe it is a weapon held against you, a list of failures to be read aloud at your judgment." David felt tears streaming down his face. He hadn't realized he was crying. "But that is not what it is," the being said, and the compassion in those words nearly broke him. "The book of life is not your condemnation. It is your possibility. It is the living record of consciousness itself, written in frequencies you have forgotten how to read." The being extended one hand toward him. The fingers were long, elegant. They glowed faintly from within. "Come," the voice said. "Let me show you what the churches have hidden. Let me show you what Jesus came to teach before his message was turned into chains." David looked at that outstretched hand, at the light pulsing behind the being, at the lake water still rippling in perfect circles beneath the floating craft. He thought about Margaret, about the fire, about 3 years of drowning in guilt. Then he thought about those words in Revelation, the book of life, and he realized he'd been waiting for this moment his entire existence, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell him that maybe, just maybe, the story he'd been taught wasn't the whole truth. David reached up and took the being's hand. The moment their skin touched, the world disappeared. Inside the translucent craft, David couldn't tell where the walls ended and space began. Everything was light, not blinding, not overwhelming, just present, everywhere. The interior seemed to breathe with its own consciousness, forming symbols that moved and shifted like living calligraphy written in pure energy. The symbols weren't random. David could feel that even though he didn't understand them. They had meaning, purpose. They flowed across surfaces that weren't quite solid, forming patterns that his eyes could follow but his mind couldn't quite grasp. The being guided him forward with a gentle touch on his shoulder. Ahead of them, a panel of energy pulsed in the center of the space. It beat, actually beat, like a heart made of light, contracting and expanding in a rhythm that David could feel in his own chest. "This," the being said, its voice resonating through David's entire body, "is the book of life." The being reached out and touched the air above the panel. Where its fingers made contact, ripples spread outward like drops falling into still water. The panel responded immediately, brightening, expanding, coming alive with images that made David's breath catch. He saw memories, human memories, thousands of them, millions, flashing across the surface of the panel in cascading waves of light and color. A child laughing as his father lifted him into the air. A woman giving birth, her face twisted in pain and joy. Soldiers dying in muddy trenches. A young couple's first kiss under a streetlight. An old man taking his last breath, surrounded by family. Prayers whispered in darkness. Lies told in daylight. Acts of kindness no one witnessed. Cruelties committed in secret. All of it. Everything. Every moment that had ever mattered to anyone, recorded here in frequencies of light that pulsed with life. But it wasn't just images. David could feel the emotions attached to each memory. They had texture, weight, color. Joy glowed golden, warm like sunrise. Love radiated in soft pink and violet hues that made his chest ache. Fear flickered in jagged orange patterns. Grief moved in deep blue waves that felt like drowning. And guilt. God. The guilt. It appeared as muddy brown tendrils that twisted and coiled, wrapping around brighter colors and dimming them. David recognized that color immediately. He'd been carrying it for 3 years. Each emotion, the being said softly, exists at a specific frequency. Truth vibrates clearly. Lies create dissonance. Love harmonizes. Hate fractures. The being moved its hand again, and the panel shifted, focused. The cascade of human memories narrowed until David was looking at something specific, his own life, written in lines of light. He saw himself as a boy, shelving books in his father's study. Then as a young man, proposing to Margaret by the river. That moment shimmered in brilliant gold and pink, so beautiful it made him want to look away. Their wedding day. The birth of their stillborn daughter. A flash of deep purple grief. 28 years of marriage, compressed into ribbons of light that contained every argument, every laugh, every quiet moment. And then the fire. The panel showed it in excruciating detail. The library engulfed in flames. Margaret running toward the entrance. David frozen in the parking lot, her face appearing in a second-floor window. The roof collapsing in a shower of sparks and ash. The guilt that followed appeared as thick, dark brown tendrils that wrapped around every memory that came after, choking them, dimming them. David fell to his knees. He couldn't watch anymore. "I let her die," he whispered. "I just stood there." "Stop," the being said gently. Its hand touched David's shoulder, and warmth flooded through him. "Look again, but this time, see what actually happened." The panel shifted. The memory replayed, but now David could see things he'd never noticed. The building was already collapsing when Margaret went inside. The stairs were gone. Even if he'd followed her, he would have died too, and saved no one. "You could not have reached her," the being said. "Your body knew this. It froze not from cowardice, but from recognition that following meant death without purpose." The being touched the panel again, and something changed. The brown tendrils of guilt began to shimmer, shift. "Nothing is lost," the being said. "Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only transform. Your guilt is simply love that has not yet remembered how to flow freely." The panel expanded, showing faces David didn't recognize. Hundreds of them, all marked by the same brown tendrils of guilt and shame. And then, one by one, the tendrils began to dissolve, replaced by softer colors. Forgiveness appeared as pale blue light, soft, clean. It moved through the dark patterns like water washing away mud. David saw a man who'd abandoned his family learning to forgive himself. A woman who'd caused a fatal accident finding peace through service. A father who'd failed his children discovering that failure wasn't final. All of them healing, all of them transforming. "The record is not fixed," the being said. "Every moment of genuine forgiveness rewrites the pattern. Every act of authentic love edits the frequency." David looked at his own timeline again. The brown tendrils were still there, but now he could see thin threads of pale blue beginning to form. Small moments where he'd been kind to himself. Those moments were healing him, slowly, writing new patterns into the living book. Tears streamed down David's face, not from sorrow, from understanding. "The book of life isn't about judgment," he whispered. "No," the being said. "It's about possibility. It's about showing you what you've created so you can decide what you want to create next." David reached toward the panel. His fingers touched the surface where his own guilt was displayed. The brown tendrils felt cold, dense, but beneath them he could feel the warmth of the love that had been there first. "Can I change it?" David asked. "You already are," the being said. "Every moment you choose to forgive yourself, the frequency shifts. The book is always being written, always being edited. By you." David closed his eyes and thought about Margaret. Not about the fire, about her laugh, the way she used to steal his coffee in the mornings. When he opened his eyes, the panel had changed. The brown tendrils had thinned slightly, not gone, but lighter. He was healing, right here, right now. The panel began to glow brighter. The light intensified until David had to shield his eyes. And in that light, something else was forming. Someone else. The light in the center of the craft grew so bright that David thought it would consume everything. But it didn't hurt. Somehow, impossibly, it was gentle. like looking directly at the sun but feeling only warmth. And then, in the heart of that radiance, a figure took shape. A man. Simple robes, dark hair, hands that looked like they'd known work and dirt and the weight of wood. Jesus. David knew without being told. The knowing went deeper than recognition. It bypassed thought entirely and struck something fundamental in his soul. This was the presence he'd spent his entire life praying toward. And he was here. Actually here. Not as a painting in stained glass. Not as a metaphor. As a living presence standing in front of him, radiating something that David had no words for. Heat and gentleness. Power and humility. Authority and absolute compassion. Jesus didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence spoke volumes that no language could contain. Every cell in David's body responded to him, recognizing something it had been searching for. The fear David had been carrying, not just for 3 years, but for his entire life, dissolved completely, like ice under a blowtorch. It simply ceased to exist in proximity to this presence. The alien being beside David moved. Slowly, gracefully, it bowed. Not a casual nod, a full, reverent bow of a student before a master. He came, the being said, and for the first time David heard emotion in its voice, to teach humanity how to edit the light. Jesus turned his gaze toward David. Those eyes, they weren't just looking at him. They were looking through him, into him, seeing every secret, every shame, every dark corner he'd tried to hide, and there was no condemnation in that gaze. None. Only understanding so complete it made David want to collapse. Jesus raised one hand. A simple gesture, palm up, fingers slightly curved, and the entire field of light around them responded. The panel that had been showing memories shifted. The patterns of guilt and pain began to change. Not erased, not deleted, but transformed. The brown tendrils of David's guilt brightened, softened, becoming something that looked almost like gold. The dark patterns weren't being removed. They were being healed. Every gesture he made, the alien whispered, every word he spoke, it all altered the frequency. He wasn't performing miracles in the way you've been taught. He was demonstrating what human consciousness is capable of when it operates from unconditional love. Jesus moved his hand again, and more patterns shifted. David saw flashes of the beings he'd healed, the lepers, the blind, the paralyzed. But now David could see what was really happening. Jesus wasn't imposing health from outside. He was helping them remember the frequency of wholeness that already existed within them. He was tuning their consciousness back to the original pattern. Love isn't just an emotion, the alien continued. It's a technology, a frequency, the most powerful force in existence. It reorganizes matter. It rewrites patterns. David felt something touch his chest, not physically, deeper than that. Like someone had reached inside and plucked a string he didn't know existed. The vibration moved through him, soft at first, then stronger. It resonated with every cell, and where it moved, things changed. The grief he'd been carrying for Margaret didn't disappear, but it softened, became bearable, became something he could hold without being crushed. The guilt for not saving her didn't vanish, but it transformed, became understanding, became acceptance of human limits against fire and collapsing beams. He was being tuned, like an instrument that had been out of key for so long it forgot what harmony felt like. Tears poured down David's face, but these weren't tears of pain. They were release, like 3 years of pressure finally finding a way out. The tears themselves seemed to change as they fell. They hit the floor of the craft and shimmered, turning into drops of light that dispersed like prayers made visible. Jesus watched him cry with infinite patience, as if he had all the time in the universe. The guilt, David managed to choke out. I thought it was what I deserved. I thought carrying it was how I honored her. The alien spoke gently. Guilt honored nothing. It only dimmed the light of the love you shared. Jesus lowered his hand, and the gesture felt like a blessing, like permission, like being told that it was okay to forgive himself. David understood something then, something that shattered everything he'd been taught in church. Knowledge without love was worthless, cold, gray, dead. You could know every verse of Scripture, memorize every theological argument, understand every doctrine, but if you didn't have love, real, unconditional, transformative love, you had nothing. And every book, even the divine ones, needed a compassionate reader, someone who understood that the point wasn't judgment, it was healing, it was growth. It was the endless possibility of transformation. Jesus smiled, not with his mouth, with his entire presence. And in that smile, David felt himself being rewritten, not into something new, into something he'd always been meant to be, whole, forgiven, free. The light around Jesus began to fade, but the warmth remained. The lesson remained, and David knew he would carry it for the rest of his life. Jesus' presence faded slowly, like dawn retreating back into night, but the warmth he left behind remained. David stood trembling in the center of the craft, his entire understanding of reality cracking open like an egg, revealing something impossible inside. The alien being turned to face him fully. Those cosmic eyes held patience that felt older than stars. "You need to understand what you just witnessed," the being said. "Not as miracle, not as magic, but as science. Spiritual science that your species has forgotten." David wiped his face with shaking hands. "I don't understand. How is any of this science?" "The Book of Life," the being began, gesturing toward the still glowing panel, "is not a metaphor. It is an actual field, a quantum field of living memory that exists beyond your perception of three-dimensional space." The panel shifted, showing what looked like waves. Endless waves of light intersecting, overlapping, creating patterns of impossible complexity. "Every thought you have," the being continued, "every emotion you feel, every choice you make, it emits a pattern, a frequency. These patterns are not abstract. They are real, measurable, and they register in this field eternally." David stared at the waves. They looked almost like the ocean, but made of pure light instead of water. "So, everything I've ever thought is recorded somewhere." "Not somewhere," the being corrected gently. "Everywhere. The field exists in all places simultaneously. It is the fabric that consciousness writes upon. You call it many names. The Akashic Records, the Book of Life, universal consciousness. But it is simply the natural recording medium of thought itself." The being touched the panel again, and the waves began to separate into distinct colors. "Good and evil," it said, "are not judgments imposed by an external God. They are frequencies, states of harmony or dissonance. When consciousness operates from love, from unity, from compassion, it creates coherent patterns. Beautiful patterns. These are what you call good." The golden and pink waves flowed smoothly, creating spirals and fractals that looked like sacred geometry. But when consciousness operates from fear, from separation, from hatred, it creates chaotic patterns, dissonant ones. These are what you call evil. Dark orange and muddy brown waves appeared, jagged and broken, clashing against each other in ways that made David's eyes hurt. "Neither is permanent," the being said. "Both are simply expressions of consciousness in different states, and consciousness can always be tuned, always be shifted, always be healed." "That's what Jesus was doing," David whispered, understanding blooming in his chest. "He was showing people how to tune themselves." "Yes." The being's voice carried something like pride. "He came to demonstrate what human consciousness is truly capable of. He showed you that matter responds to frequency. That illness is simply dissonant vibration. That death itself is only a pattern that can be overwritten by one who knows how." The panel showed Jesus again, but this time David could see the waves around him. Every gesture, every word, every touch sent out ripples of pure, coherent frequency that literally reorganized the patterns they encountered. "The key," the being said, and its voice dropped to something almost reverent, "is forgiveness. Forgiveness is the code that reorganizes light. It is the frequency that transforms dissonance back into harmony." David thought about his guilt, the brown tendrils he'd seen wrapped around his memories. "When I forgive," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke, "I'm not just feeling better. I'm actually changing the pattern, changing what's written in this field." "Exactly." The being seemed pleased. "Forgiveness is not sentiment. It is transformation. It is the conscious choice to release a dissonant frequency and allow it to return to coherence. When you truly forgive, not just say the words, but feel it in every cell of your being, you literally rewrite the record." David saw his own timeline again, the moments where he'd allowed himself small mercies, where he'd remembered Margaret with love instead of only pain. Each of those moments had created pale blue threads, forgiveness threads, And where they touched the brown guilt, the guilt had lightened. Love has to be felt, David said, not just spoken. Yes, the being's eyes brightened. Words without frequency are empty. Your churches taught you to say you forgive, to declare it. But declaration without genuine feeling is just noise. It changes nothing. The images around them shifted, becoming softer. The harsh edges smoothed. The chaotic patterns began to organize themselves. It was like watching a storm calm, like watching chaos. Remember how to be peace. David felt something in his own chest responding. That same vibration Jesus had touched. It was still humming, still resonating. And as he stood there, allowing himself to feel actual compassion for the man he'd been 3 years ago, the terrified husband frozen in a parking lot, something changed. The brown tendrils inside him loosened, just slightly, but enough to let him breathe deeper than he had in years. Hell, he said suddenly, the realization hitting him like lightning, isn't a place God sends people. It's a frequency. It's what happens when a mind refuses to forgive itself. When consciousness gets trapped in dissonant patterns and can't find its way back to harmony. Yes, the being said softly. And heaven? David looked at the golden waves still flowing on the panel. Heaven is learning to be grateful, learning to operate from love instead of fear, learning to create coherent patterns instead of chaotic ones. Yes, David felt tears on his face again, but these were different. These were tears of relief, of understanding, of recognizing that salvation wasn't about being saved from an angry God. It was about being shown how to save yourself from the prison of your own unforgiven thoughts. Jesus didn't die to pay a debt, David whispered. He lived to show us how to change our frequency, how to rewrite our patterns, how to forgive and be forgiven in ways that actually transform us. The being smiled, actually smiled. Its face shifted in a way that was almost human. Now you understand, it said. Now you know the true meaning of salvation. Not rescue from punishment, but awakening to your own power to transform, to heal, to reorganize the light you've created into something that serves rather than suffocates you. The craft seemed to pulse with approval. The walls, if they were walls, glowed brighter. David stood in the center of that light, feeling 3 years of crushing guilt begin to lift. Not gone, not erased, but transforming. Becoming something he could learn from instead of something that destroyed him. The Book of Life wasn't a weapon held over humanity's head. It was a mirror, showing you what you'd created so you could decide what you wanted to create next. And forgiveness was the brush that let you repaint it all. David opened his eyes and found himself standing in the clearing by Lake Norris. The craft was gone. The alien was gone. But the experience remained, burned into every cell of his being, like a brand made of light instead of fire. The earth beneath his bare feet pulsed, actually pulsed. He could feel it through his soles, a gentle rhythm like a heartbeat, as if the ground itself was still vibrating with the energy of what had just happened. He looked down and his breath caught. Where the craft had hovered, a symbol was burned into the grass, not burned like fire damage. Burned like light had been pressed into the earth so intensely it left a permanent mark, a cross, but not the simple cross he'd seen in churches his entire life. This one spiraled. The vertical and horizontal beams curved and twisted around themselves in a pattern that looked almost like DNA, like the double helix of life itself had been written in sacred geometry. The symbol glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulsing in time with the heartbeat he felt through his feet. David fell to his knees. The weight of what he'd experienced crashed into him all at once. The impossible craft, the being with cosmic eyes, Jesus standing in living light, the Book of Life showing him that memory could be healed, that guilt could transform, that nothing was written in stone, only in frequencies that could be tuned and shifted and changed. It was too much, too overwhelming, too real. He pressed his palms against the spiraling cross symbol, and warmth flooded up through his hands. "Thank you," he whispered, to the being, to Jesus, to whatever force in the universe had decided a broken librarian needed to see behind the veil. The memories of the library fire came rushing back, but this time they felt different. He remembered the flames consuming the building he'd dedicated his life to, the smoke billowing black against the afternoon sky, Margaret's face in the second-floor window, the sound of the roof collapsing. But now he could see it clearly. The fire outside had been a mirror of the fire inside. The external flames that destroyed wood and paper were the same flames that had been consuming him from within for 3 years. Guilt burning, shame burning, self-hatred burning. The only difference was direction. One fire destroyed a building, the other fire destroyed a soul. The same fire, he said out loud, just turned inward. The being's words echoed in his mind. Nothing is written in stone, only in light. Light could be changed. Light could be redirected. Light could be transformed. And forgiveness was how you did it. David closed his eyes and did something he hadn't been able to do since the fire. He spoke directly to Margaret, not to a memory, not to a ghost, but to whatever part of her still existed in that quantum field the being had shown him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I stood there. I froze. And you died because I wasn't brave enough to move." The words he'd been carrying for 3 years finally came out. All of them. Every accusation, every condemnation, every brutal judgment he'd passed on himself in the dark hours of sleepless nights. "I should have run in after you. I should have tried. Even if it killed me, I should have tried." The clearing was silent. Just the gentle sounds of early morning, birds starting to wake, wind moving through pine trees. And then he felt it. A breeze. Soft, warm, carrying a scent that made his heart stop. Wood smoke and vanilla. Margaret's perfume. The smell of her hair after she'd been reading by the fireplace. The breeze touched his face like a hand, like a gentle caress, like forgiveness made physical. "You couldn't have saved me," he heard, not with his ears, with something deeper, the same way he'd heard the alien speak. "The building was already gone. You would have died for nothing, and I needed you to live." David sobbed. His whole body shook with it. "I needed you to live." The voice, her voice, continued. "Because you're not finished yet. You have work to do, light to reorganize, patterns to heal. Not just yours. Others." "I don't know how," David choked out. "You do now," Margaret's presence said. "You've seen the truth. You know that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's power. It's the code that rewrites everything." The breeze grew stronger for a moment, wrapping around him like an embrace. Then it faded, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and vanilla. David opened his eyes. The spiraling cross symbol was fading, the light dimming. In another few seconds, it would be gone completely, leaving only slightly flattened grass as evidence that anything unusual had happened here. But David would remember. God, he would remember. He stood slowly, his legs shaking but stable. The crushing weight he'd carried for 3 years wasn't gone. Not completely, but it was lighter, transformed, becoming something that could teach instead of torture. The clearing fell completely silent. The divine hum faded. The earth stopped pulsing. But David felt different, fundamentally different, like he'd been tuned to a new frequency, like the dissonant waves of guilt had been reorganized into something that could finally harmonize with the rest of his life. He looked at the lake, at the sky beginning to lighten with approaching dawn, at the cabin waiting for him with its burned books and empty rooms. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again, because he knew now. He knew that the book of life wasn't a record of condemnation. It was a field of infinite possibility, and forgiveness was the brush that let you repaint every page. He took a deep breath. The air tasted different, cleaner, like the universe itself was breathing relief. And David walked back toward the cabin, carrying the truth like a seed planted in soil made of light. David returned to the cabin as dawn broke over Lake Norris, and the first thing he did was find his old journal, the leather-bound notebook he'd received as a gift from Margaret on their 10th anniversary. He'd stopped writing in it after she died, couldn't bear to put words on paper when everything inside him felt like ash. But now his hands moved without hesitation. He sat at the kitchen table, opened to the first blank page, and began to write. Everything. He wrote everything. The craft hovering over the water, the being with eyes that held galaxies, the book of life pulsing like a living heart, Jesus standing in light that didn't burn, the brown tendrils of guilt transforming into threads of forgiveness, Margaret's voice in the breeze. His handwriting was shaky at first, uncertain, but as the words flowed, something shifted. Each sentence became more than just a record. Each phrase transformed into prayer, into intention, into seeds being planted in soil he couldn't see but could feel. He wrote for hours. The sun climbed higher. Coffee grew cold in his cup. His hand cramped, but he couldn't stop. The experience demanded to be documented, needed to be preserved. Not just for him, but for something larger he didn't fully understand yet. When he finally set the pen down, his hand aching, he realized what he'd created wasn't just a journal entry. It was a testament, a witness statement from someone who'd seen behind the curtain of reality and lived to tell about it. The writing became a ritual. Every morning he'd wake before dawn, make coffee, and add more to the testament. Some days he wrote about new insights. Other days he revisited old memories, seeing them now through the lens of what he'd learned. The fire, Margaret's death, his years of guilt, all of it looked different now. Not erased, not justified, but transformed. Like how a seed has to break open before it can grow. Each memory he wrote about felt like it was being healed in the act of documentation. The brown tendrils loosening, the dissonant frequencies gradually finding harmony. At night he dreamed. But these weren't the nightmares that had haunted him for 3 years. These were different. Visionary. Teaching. He dreamed of pages made of fire. Not destroying fire. Creative fire. The pages turned themselves, each one revealing landscapes he'd never seen. Cities of light. Beings moving between dimensions like travelers crossing borders. Humans waking up to their own power, their own ability to reorganize the light they'd created. And Jesus appeared in these visions. Not as the stern judge from religious paintings, not as the suffering figure on a cross, but as a presence, a frequency, a living demonstration of what love looks like when it operates at full power. Jesus didn't speak in the visions. He didn't need to. His presence alone taught volumes. The way he moved through the dreamscapes, every gesture creating ripples of healing, every glance transforming chaos into order. David would wake from these dreams with tears on his face and a phrase echoing in his mind. Love what you were, and what you will become will reveal itself. The words weren't spoken. They arose from silence itself, from the space between thoughts, from the frequency that existed before language divided everything into separate pieces. He wrote the phrase in his journal, underlined it, returned to it again and again. Love what you were, not tolerate, not accept grudgingly, but actually love. Love the man who froze in the parking lot. Love the husband who couldn't save his wife. Love the broken librarian who spent 3 years punishing himself for being human. Love him. Forgive him. See him with the same compassion Jesus had shown. As the weeks passed, David noticed something extraordinary. The book of life inside him, the one the alien had shown him existed in everyone, was rewriting itself. He could feel it, not physically, but in some deeper way that bypassed the body entirely. The voices from his past, the accusations and judgments he'd carried like stones in his pockets, were changing, transforming, becoming something that sounded less like condemnation and more like gratitude. He was grateful he'd loved Margaret so deeply that losing her hurt this much, grateful he'd cared about the library enough to mourn its loss, grateful he was capable of feeling guilt, because guilt meant he had a conscience, meant he cared about doing right even when he failed. The gratitude didn't erase the pain, but it reorganized it, made it bearable, made it purposeful. One evening, as sunset painted the lake in shades of gold and pink, David sat on his porch and had a realization that made him laugh out loud. Every soul was a verse in the creation. Not a chapter, not a paragraph, a single verse. Brief, essential, unique, contributing to a poem so vast that no one could comprehend the whole thing, only their own line and maybe a few lines around them. And his verse wasn't finished yet. The words were still being written, still being edited, still being reorganized by every choice he made, every thought he held, every frequency he generated. Even repentance, he realized, was a form of light, not darkness, not shame, but the light of consciousness recognizing dissonance and choosing to tune itself back to harmony. Repentance wasn't punishment, it was course correction. It was the universe's way of helping you find your way back to the frequency you were always meant to operate from. David looked at the journal beside him. Nearly full now. Pages covered in his handwriting, documenting the most impossible and most real experience of his life. He'd been so lonely for 3 years, isolated in this cabin with his guilt and his burned books and his memories that cut like glass. But writing the testament, he'd found something unexpected. In the solitude, in the act of documenting his own transformation, he discovered communion, connection, not with other people, not yet, but with something larger, with the field itself, the book of life, the living consciousness that held every thought, every choice, every moment of every being that had ever existed. He wasn't alone, had never been alone. The isolation had been an illusion created by dissonant frequencies that made him feel separate from everything. But he was tuning now, reorganizing, finding his way back to the harmony that had always been available. The sunset deepened to purple. Stars began appearing. David closed the journal and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of all those written words, all those healed memories, all those seeds planted. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. He was part of something eternal, a story being written by consciousness itself, and his verse, however brief, mattered. 3 months after the encounter by the lake, David woke at 3:47 in the morning. The time that used to bring nightmares now brought anticipation. He sat up in bed, already knowing something was about to happen. The cabin filled with golden light, not harsh, not intrusive, just present, gentle, like dawn arriving in the middle of the night. The being materialized in the center of his small bedroom, surrounded by that same luminous clarity it had carried the first time. But now David could see details he'd missed before. The way the light seemed to move through the being rather than around it. The way its presence created ripples in the air like heat waves over summer pavement. "You came back," David said. No fear this time, just recognition, like greeting an old friend. "I came to remind you of your purpose," the being said, and its voice held tenderness that made David's throat tighten. "You have been healing, transforming, rewriting your own book. But the work is not only for yourself." David stood slowly. "What do you mean?" The being raised one hand and the air between them shimmered. Images appeared, not on a screen, just floating in three-dimensional space, real and solid and impossible all at once. He saw people, hundreds of them, thousands, all over the world, each one sitting quietly, eyes closed, hands pressed to their chests. And inside each person, a book was opening, their own book of life, their own record of memories and choices and patterns. As David watched, forgiveness happened. One person forgave a parent who'd abandoned them. Another forgave themselves for an accident that had killed someone. A third forgave a spouse who'd betrayed them. And each act of forgiveness created light, actual, visible light, bright flares that shot out from the person's chest and connected to other lights, creating networks, webs, entire planetary grids of interconnected healing. "This is happening now," the being said. "All over your world, humans are beginning to remember, beginning to wake up to their own power to reorganize the light they've created." The image shifted, zoomed out. David saw the Earth from space, covered in these threads of light. Some areas blazed brightly, others remained dark, but everywhere people were lighting up, choosing forgiveness, choosing love, choosing to tune themselves back to harmony. "Writing is your gift," the being said, turning those cosmic eyes back to David. "Words are your frequency, and your calling is to remind people of hope, to show them what's possible, to document the truth so others can recognize it when it appears in their own lives." David thought about the journal, the testament he'd been writing for 3 months. "You want me to share what happened? I want you to understand what is happening," the being corrected gently. "The Earth is not a finished book. It is a book in constant revision. Every moment, every soul is writing new verses, adding new chapters, editing old patterns that no longer serve." The image zoomed back in, showing individual people again, their books of life opening, pages turning. Some pages burned away completely. Others were being rewritten with different words, better words, words that created coherent patterns instead of chaotic ones. "And Jesus," the being continued, and reverence filled its voice, "is the master editor, the one who showed your species how to correct your own lines, how to transform dissonance into harmony, how to rewrite guilt into wisdom and pain into purpose." David watched a woman in the vision forgive her father for decades of abuse. The moment she released the grudge, truly released it, not just said the words, her entire book blazed with pale blue light. The brown tendrils of trauma dissolved. The patterns reorganized. She was healing, right there, in real time. Every error has value, the being said softly, when it brings learning. Every mistake becomes teaching when consciousness extracts wisdom from it. David thought about the fire, about Margaret, about 3 years of guilt that had nearly destroyed him. And he understood. Those years weren't wasted. They were part of his story, part of his verse in the great poem. They taught him things he couldn't have learned any other way. Compassion for people who carry guilt, understanding of how pain can trap you, recognition that transformation is always possible, no matter how deep the darkness seems. The flames that had consumed the library didn't just destroy, they also purified, burned away everything that wasn't essential, left him raw and open and ready to receive the truth when it finally appeared. The fire, David whispered. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. The being smiled. Now you understand. Now you see that even destruction serves creation, that even the darkest chapters are part of the larger story, that nothing is wasted in the universe. Everything transforms, everything serves, everything teaches. The images faded. The golden light remained. The being stepped closer, and David felt that same vibration in his chest. The tuning, the reorganization, the frequency of unconditional love adjusting every cell in his body. You are not separate from this story, the being said. You are writing it. Every choice, every thought, every act of forgiveness. You are editing the great book in real time, and others are watching, learning, following the light you create. David felt tears on his face, but these were tears of joy, of purpose, of finally understanding why he'd survived when Margaret hadn't, why he'd been allowed to see what he'd seen, why the being had chosen a broken librarian in rural Tennessee to witness the truth. He had work to do, light to create, words to write that would help others remember their own power. I understand, he said. The being's smile widened. Good. Then the real work begins now. Not just healing yourself, but helping others remember how to heal themselves. The golden light intensified for a moment, filling the entire cabin. When it faded, the being was gone. But David stood in his bedroom, smiling in the darkness, feeling, for the first time in his life, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was created to do. He walked to his desk, opened the journal, and began writing the next chapter of his testament, not just for himself anymore, but for everyone who needed to know that the book of life wasn't a weapon. It was a gift. It was possibility made visible. It was the story you told yourself being offered back to you with a simple question. Do you want to keep telling it this way? Or would you like to edit it into something better? Spring came to Tennessee with an explosion of green. Dogwoods bloomed white along the lake. Birds returned from wherever they'd spent the winter. And David Holloway sat at his kitchen table, writing letters to people he'd never met. Anonymous letters, no return address, just words on paper, sealed in plain envelopes, and left in places where they'd be found. The library in town, coffee shops, bus stops, church bulletin boards. Each letter spoke about the book of life, not as religious doctrine, not as theology, but as something real, something living. A mirror of consciousness that showed you what you'd created so you could decide what you wanted to create next. There is no punishment, he wrote in letter after letter, the words becoming a mantra. Only the opportunity to rewrite yourself, to reorganize the light you've generated, to tune your frequency back to harmony. He signed them only with a simple phrase, from someone who saw. The first responses came slowly. A young woman knocked on his door one afternoon, holding one of his letters. She'd found it tucked into a library book about grief. Her mother had died 6 months ago, and the guilt of not being there at the end was eating her alive. Did you really see this? She asked, tears streaming down her face. This book of life thing, is it real? David invited her in, made tea, and for the first time since the encounter, he spoke about what had happened by the lake. Not all of it, not the parts that would sound too impossible, but enough to let her know that forgiveness wasn't just a nice idea. It was actual technology, frequency that could reorganize pain into purpose. They talked for hours. When she left, her face looked different, lighter, like she'd set down something heavy she'd been carrying. More people came. A teenager struggling with the weight of coming out to his religious parents, an elderly man haunted by things he'd done in Vietnam, a mother who blamed herself for her son's addiction, a father who'd abandoned his family and spent 20 years drowning in shame. David's cabin became a place of pilgrimage, not in any formal way. No appointments, No schedule. Just people showing up when they needed to, drawn by the letters and the rumors spreading through the small Tennessee communities around Lake Norris. He didn't preach, didn't quote scripture unless someone asked. Instead, he taught them something simpler: how to read their own thoughts with compassion, how to look at their guilt and shame not as evidence of unworthiness, but as dissonant frequencies that could be tuned. Your thoughts create patterns, he'd tell them, using the words the being had taught him. Fear creates chaos, love creates coherence, and you get to choose, moment by moment, which frequency you want to generate. He showed them how to sit quietly and actually feel their emotions instead of running from them, how to trace guilt back to its source and recognize it as love that had forgotten how to flow, how to forgive not by declaring it, but by genuinely releasing the grip on the grudge. Each session ended the same way. David would lead them down to the lake, to the spot where the spiraling cross had burned into the grass. The symbol had faded months ago, but David swore he could still feel the energy there. A thin place, a spot where the veil between dimensions wore thin. They'd sit in silence, just breathing, just being, letting the stillness work on them in ways words couldn't. And almost everyone reported the same thing: a presence, luminous, watching them with something that felt like infinite compassion, not judging, not demanding, just witnessing, seeing them, really seeing them in ways they'd never been seen before. "What is that?" a young woman asked one evening, her voice trembling. "Who's watching us?" David smiled. The question came up every time, and every time he gave the same answer. "It's you," he said gently. "It's the reflection of your own higher consciousness. The part of you that's always been connected to the field. The part that knows you're more than your mistakes, more than your guilt, more than the dissonant frequencies you've been generating." Some people didn't understand. They wanted it to be God, or angels, or Jesus himself standing invisible at the lake's edge. But David knew better now. The presence they felt was real, but it wasn't separate from them. It was them, the awakened part, the part that had never forgotten it was made of light. As months passed, something shifted in the small communities around Lake Norris. The fear that had permeated everything, fear of judgment, fear of hell, fear of not being good enough, began to lift. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but enough to be noticeable. People started treating each other differently, with more compassion, more patience, more recognition that everyone was carrying their own dissonant frequencies and doing their best to tune them back to harmony. The churches noticed. Some pastors were curious, others were threatened. A few came to challenge David, armed with Bible verses and theological arguments about the dangers of New Age thinking. David listened to them with the same compassion he showed everyone else. Never argued, never defended, just smiled and asked them one question: does your doctrine lead to more love or more fear? Most of them left confused. A few stayed to talk longer, and one, a Methodist minister named Patricia, became a regular visitor. She'd spent 40 years preaching salvation through belief, and David's message of salvation through frequency transformation terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. "What if you're right?" she asked him one evening, sitting on his porch as fireflies began their dance over the lake. "What if we've been teaching people to fear a record book when we should have been teaching them how to rewrite it? Then you teach them differently now," David said simply. "The book is always being written, including yours, including theirs. It's never too late to edit." Faith itself was transforming in these small Tennessee communities, moving from blind belief in doctrines to lived experience of something real, something that could be felt in the chest and measured by how you treated yourself and others. People stopped asking David for answers. They started asking him how to find their own, and that, he realized, was the whole point. The being had shown him the truth, not so he could become a guru or a prophet, but so he could remind others that they had the same access to the field, the same ability to tune their frequency, the same power to reorganize their own light. By the time winter returned, the cabin by Lake Norris had become something unexpected. Not a church, not a temple, just a place where broken people came to remember they were capable of healing, where the dissonant found their way back to harmony, where fear slowly, gradually transformed into serenity that could be shared. And David, the broken librarian who'd lost everything in fire, had found his purpose, not in the ashes of what burned, but in the light of what could be rewritten. One night in late autumn, David sat at his kitchen table rereading the journal he'd been keeping since the encounter. Months of entries, hundreds of pages. The testament of his transformation from guilt-ridden widower to someone who understood that consciousness itself was the canvas and forgiveness was the brush. He turned to an early entry, written just days after seeing the being. His handwriting had been shaky then, uncertain. The letters cramped and small, like he was afraid to take up too much space on the page. But as he read, something strange happened. The letters began to shimmer, subtly at first. Just a faint glow around the edges of the ink, then stronger, until the words themselves seemed to be generating their own light. David blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the glow remained, getting brighter. The handwriting on the page was changing before his eyes. Not the words themselves, but the quality of them, like they were being written from the inside out instead of outside in. His heart began to race, not from fear, from recognition. Something was happening, something important. A voice spoke, not in his ears, in that deeper place, the same place where the being had spoken, where Margaret's presence had whispered forgiveness in the breeze. "You are ready," the voice said, "to read what you yourself created." David's hands trembled as he turned pages. Each one glowed now, each one revealing words he didn't remember writing, phrases that seemed to appear between the lines of his own handwriting, messages written in light instead of ink. "You are loved beyond measure." The fire was not punishment, but purification. Every moment of suffering served your awakening. "You have always been worthy." Tears blurred his vision. These weren't his words. Or maybe they were. Maybe they'd always been there, written in frequencies his conscious mind couldn't perceive until now, until he'd tuned himself enough to read what his own higher consciousness had been saying all along. He turned more pages, found entries from his darkest days, the weeks after the fire when he'd wanted to die, when the guilt had been so overwhelming he couldn't imagine surviving it. But now, surrounding those dark words written in despair, he saw other words glowing in the margins, words of love, of encouragement, of absolute certainty that he would survive, that he would heal, that this darkness was temporary and necessary and would ultimately serve his transformation. His higher self had been speaking to him the entire time, writing messages of hope in frequencies he couldn't yet hear, waiting for him to tune himself enough to finally read them. "The Book of Life," David whispered, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking, manifests through whoever awakens. It wasn't just a record stored somewhere in the quantum field. It was alive, active, responsive. It wrote itself through consciousness. And when consciousness awakened, when it tuned to the frequency of love and forgiveness and compassion, the book revealed itself, showed you what you'd been creating all along. No soul was condemned. That was the lie. The terrible lie that religions had used to control people through fear for thousands of years. Souls weren't condemned. They were just asleep, operating from dissonant frequencies, creating chaotic patterns, unable to read the messages of love their own higher consciousness was constantly sending. And forgiveness was the alarm clock, the frequency that woke you up. That let you finally see what had been true all along, that you were loved, you were worthy, you were capable of healing. You had always had the power to rewrite your own story. David sobbed, but these weren't tears of pain. These were tears of relief so profound they felt like his body was purging years of unnecessary suffering all at once. The truth didn't terrify him. How could it? The truth was that he'd never been alone, never been condemned, never been outside the love that held everything together. He'd just been asleep, operating from fear, creating dissonant patterns, unable to see the light he'd been generating even in his darkest moments. But he was awake now. And the waking didn't come with trumpets or angels or dramatic supernatural intervention. It came with the quiet recognition that the voice he'd been listening to his entire life, the one that told him he was broken, unworthy, permanently stained by his failures, was a liar. The real voice, his true voice, the frequency of his actual being, had been whispering truth all along. He just hadn't been tuned to hear it until now. David looked at his hands. They were glowing too, faintly. The same light he saw on the pages. He was generating it, had always been generating it. The light of consciousness becoming aware of itself. For the first time in his 56 years, David Holloway felt his own name written in the field of creation, not as condemnation, not as a record of failures, but as a unique frequency, a specific note in the symphony, a verse in the eternal poem. He mattered, had always mattered, would always matter. Not because of what he'd accomplished or how perfectly he'd lived, but simply because he existed. Because consciousness had chosen to express itself through the particular pattern that was David Holloway. And that was enough, had always been enough, would always be enough. He closed the glowing journal and pressed it against his chest. Outside, Lake Norris reflected the stars. Inside, David reflected the truth. The Book of Life wasn't a weapon held over humanity. It was a love letter written by consciousness to itself. A reminder that no matter how lost you felt, no matter how dissonant your frequencies became, no matter how deep the darkness seemed, you were never, ever beyond the reach of transformation. You just had to wake up, tune yourself, choose forgiveness, and read the messages of love that had been waiting for you all along. By the following spring, David had made a decision that surprised even himself. The old storage shed near the lake, the one he'd been using for firewood and forgotten tools, was going to become something new, something necessary, a library, not like the one that had burned, smaller, simpler, but alive in ways the old one never was. He spent weeks clearing it out, replacing rotted boards, installing windows that faced the water. The work felt like prayer. Each nail driven was an act of resurrection. Each board placed was a declaration that what fire destroys, consciousness can rebuild. When it was finished, he painted the spiral cross symbol on the door. Not hidden, not subtle, right there for everyone to see. The sign of continuous healing. The reminder that nothing was written in stone, only in light that could be reorganized, retuned, transformed. He didn't fill it with books at first, didn't order from Amazon or drive to used bookstores looking for inventory. Instead, he waited, put out the word through the people who'd been visiting him. And something extraordinary happened. People brought their stories, not written in published volumes, written in journals, in letters, in scraps of paper where they documented their own transformations, their own encounters with the frequencies of forgiveness and love. A young mother brought a notebook filled with letters to the daughter she'd given up for adoption 20 years ago. Letters she'd never sent but had written anyway, pouring love into words that had nowhere to go until now. An elderly veteran brought a shoebox of confessions, things he'd done in war that haunted him, written down in the middle of sleepless nights, never shared with anyone, but now, somehow, ready to be witnessed. A teenager brought poetry about gender dysphoria and the terror of being born in the wrong body, words that had saved their life when nothing else could. These became the library, not dead words in mass-produced books, living testimonies, breathing documents of human transformation, evidence that the Book of Life wasn't somewhere else. It was here, being written in real time by everyone who had the courage to document their healing. David placed each contribution on the shelves with reverence, treated them like sacred texts, because they were. Each one was proof that consciousness could reorganize itself, that guilt could transform into wisdom, that shame could become strength. People came, young and old, believers and skeptics, broken and healing and everything in between. They'd sit in the small space that smelled of fresh pine and lake water, reading each other's stories, recognizing themselves in someone else's pain, finding hope in another person's transformation. The memory is the paper where God still writes, David would tell them, not preaching, just observing, sharing what he'd learned from the being, from Jesus, from his own journey through fire and guilt, and finally into light. No sermons, no doctrine, no theology that had to be believed or defended or argued over. Just listening, just presence, just the quiet recognition that everyone who walked through that door was carrying frequencies that wanted to be tuned. The library became a sanctuary, but not in the religious sense. In the original sense of the word, a safe place. A place where you could bring your dissonance and have it witnessed without judgment. Where you could read about someone else's chaos and see how they'd found their way back to harmony. And Jesus, the real Jesus, not the one on Sunday school posters, began appearing everywhere David looked. Not literally, not physically, but in the spaces between. In the compassion people showed each other. In the forgiveness someone finally gave themselves after years of self-punishment. In the light that appeared in eyes that had been dark with despair just weeks before. Jesus was in the act of healing itself, in the frequency of unconditional love. in the gesture of reorganizing chaos back into coherence, not as a person standing outside watching, but as the very force that made transformation possible. David would watch a woman read another woman's story about surviving abuse and see tears streaming down both their faces. That was Jesus. The connection, the recognition, the love flowing between two souls who'd never met but understood each other perfectly. He'd watch a man finally write down the thing he'd been carrying in secret for 40 years and see the relief wash over him like baptism. That was Jesus. The release, the forgiveness, the frequency of love breaking through the dissonance of shame. Faith, David realized, wasn't belief in doctrine. It was simpler than that. Faith was the gesture of opening the book again, of being willing to look at your own story one more time, of trusting that what looked like permanent stains could be tuned into different frequencies. Faith was the decision to keep writing, keep editing, keep believing that transformation was possible even when the evidence seemed overwhelming that you were too broken to heal. The fire that had destroyed the original library, the fire that had taken Margaret and 32 years of David's work and nearly destroyed David himself, that fire had changed, not in the past. The past was what it was, but in David's relationship to it. The fire that had once only destroyed now warmed, the memory that had once only tortured now taught, the loss that had once only hollowed him out now created space for something new to grow. The library of his soul, the internal book of life that the being had shown him, was rebuilding itself, not through denial, not through pretending the fire never happened, but through the slow, patient work of reorganizing those burned memories into frequencies that could serve rather than suffocate. Every person who walked through the door of that small library by the lake was doing the same work, rebuilding, reorganizing, retuning, taking the chaos of their past and gradually, persistently, lovingly transforming it into patterns that could teach others. And it happened in silence, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of presence, the kind of silence where healing happens without words, where frequencies adjust without explanation, where light reorganizes itself back into coherence just because it's witnessed with compassion. David would sit in his chair by the window, watching people read each other's testimonies, and feel Margaret's presence, not as a ghost, not as something separate, but as part of the field itself, part of the living consciousness that held every memory, every choice, every moment of love that had ever been generated. She was there, in the frequency of compassion flowing through the space, in the forgiveness people were finding, in the light appearing where darkness had been. And David understood that this was what the being had meant when it said his work was just beginning, not building a physical library, but creating a space where the book of life could manifest through awakened people, where consciousness could write itself into new patterns, where the eternal editing process could happen in community instead of isolation. The small library by Lake Norris became known throughout the region, not famous, not publicized, just quietly present, a place where broken people could bring their pieces and discover they weren't broken at all, just temporarily out of tune, just waiting for someone to remind them they had the power to reorganize their own light. And David, the librarian who'd lost everything to fire, had become something new. Not a priest, not a guru, not a teacher in any formal sense, just a witness, a space holder. A reminder that the book of life was always being written and always open to revision and always available to those brave enough to pick up the pen. On a calm morning in early summer, David woke before dawn with that familiar pull, the one that had led him to the lake the night the being first appeared, the one that had guided him through 3 years of transformation, the one that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. He walked barefoot to the water's edge. The grass was wet with dew. The air carried the scent of pine and possibility. Stars still scattered across the sky even as the eastern horizon began to lighten. And then he felt it. Light, but not from outside, from within. His chest began to glow, faintly at first, then stronger. The same luminescence he'd seen on his journal pages, the same frequency he'd watched appear in the people who came to the library when they finally forgave themselves. He was generating light, actual visible light, not metaphorical, real. David looked down at the lake's surface. The water was perfectly still, a mirror, and in that mirror he saw his reflection surrounded by stars. Not the stars above, different stars, closer, brighter, forming patterns around his head and shoulders like a crown made of constellations. "You know how to read the infinite now," the voice said. The being's voice, but also not. It was Jesus's voice, Margaret's voice, his own voice, all of them together. The frequency of love itself, speaking through every channel at once. Tears came, but David was smiling, because he understood. The infinite wasn't out there. It was here, in him, in everyone. The book of life wasn't a record stored in some distant dimension. It was the living field of consciousness itself, and every awakened being could read it, could write in it, could edit it. He turned from the water and saw Jesus standing on the shore, not in robes, not glowing with supernatural light, just present, real, human and divine and both and neither. The ultimate demonstration of what consciousness looks like when it operates from perfect love. Jesus didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence said everything, and David could read it now, could see the patterns, could understand the frequencies. "Every life is a chapter of love," the voice said, and David knew it was true. Not metaphorically true, actually true. Each soul was a unique expression of the same fundamental force. Each story contributed to a narrative so vast that calling it a book was like calling the ocean a cup of water. And all books unite in the same author. The voice continued. David understood. The author wasn't separate, wasn't standing outside the creation looking in. The author was the field itself, the living consciousness that expressed itself through every being, that wrote itself into existence moment by moment through the choices of every soul that had ever lived. God wasn't the judge reviewing the book of life. God was the book of life, and you, and Jesus, and the being from the stars, and Margaret, and everyone who'd ever brought their broken pieces to the small library by the lake. All of it. One consciousness, one author, one infinite story being told through billions of voices. The wind picked up, gentle but purposeful. It touched David's face and carried away the last tears he'd been holding. The tears of a man who'd spent 3 years punishing himself for being human. The tears of a husband who couldn't save his wife. The tears of a soul who'd finally remembered it, had never been separate from the love that created everything. The wind carried those tears across the water like blessings, like prayers made visible, like frequencies of forgiveness spreading across the lake and into the world beyond. The lake became completely still, not a ripple, not a wave, just perfect mirror-smooth surface that reflected both the fading stars above and the growing light within David's chest. A mirror between worlds, a thin place where the veil dissolved completely, where you could see that there was no separation between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, between the book and the living of it. David felt something shift in his understanding, not learning something new, but remembering something he'd always known but had forgotten in the trauma of being born into a body that felt separate from everything else. He had never been alone, not for 1 second of his 57 years. Not in the parking lot watching the library burn, not in the cabin drowning in guilt, not in the darkest moment of the darkest night when he'd wanted to stop existing. The field had always been there, holding him, recording him, loving him with a love that didn't require him to be anything other than exactly what he was. And now he could feel it, not believe it, not hope for it, but actually feel it. The presence of infinite consciousness witnessing him, writing him, being him. The universe spoke, not with words. With knowing that appeared fully formed in David's awareness. Nothing is written in stone, only in light. And the light is God in you. David laughed, actually laughed. Standing barefoot at the edge of Lake Norris as dawn broke over Tennessee, he laughed with the pure joy of finally getting the joke. The churches had taught him to fear the book of life, to see it as evidence that would condemn him, to believe his mistakes were permanent stains that could never be washed away. But it was all backwards. The book wasn't the problem. Fear was the problem. Forgetting was the problem. Operating from the illusion of separation was the problem. The book itself was just consciousness becoming aware of itself. Light recognizing light. Love writing love. The infinite creating itself through the finite. God experiencing God through every soul that had ever lived. And nothing was permanent except the capacity to transform, to heal, to reorganize, to tune back to harmony no matter how dissonant you'd become. David stood in the growing light, feeling his name written in frequencies that would never fade, not because he'd earned it, not because he'd finally gotten good enough, but because he'd always been there, always mattered, always been a necessary verse in the eternal poem. The being was gone. Jesus was gone. The glowing had faded, but David remained, standing on ordinary ground, breathing ordinary air, living an ordinary life, except now he knew. Now he could read the infinite in every moment, could see the book of life writing itself through every choice, could feel the presence of God not as something separate, but as the very field of awareness through which he experienced everything. He walked back toward the cabin as sun touched the lake, and in that simple act, one foot in front of the other, moving through space made of light, David Holloway understood that the extraordinary had never been separate from the ordinary. It was all one book, one infinite story, one consciousness writing itself into existence through every being brave enough to pick up the pen and add their verse. And the universe continued writing, continued editing, continued transforming chaos into coherence one forgiven moment at a time, forever.